Hi, hello, and welcome back to this series of Foundations of Bioenergetics with me, Devraj. And as mentioned before, I'm not just going to cover bioenergetics. I'm going to look at the whole wider field of body-based therapy, of which bioenergetics, breathwork, catharsis are elements. Now, this week I want to look at the history of body-based therapy, particularly in the modern era. And also, with the intention to answer the question, because it's a question that a lot of people who start to get into this stuff start to ask, which is like, why are there so few trainings in body-based therapy? Why is it so hard to get good, professional, well-presented information? Why are there so few governing bodies, which are kind of approved by mainstream psychology, And in short, why is it so cult-like? So let's get into the history and look at all of these things. And it is true that, for the average person in 2025 who's become interested in the techniques of body-based therapy, likely what they're learning is not really coming down direct from mainstream psychology. And by that, mainstream psychology, what I mean is, the school of thought, of psychological thought that emerged from Freud in the 1890s in Austria, in Vienna, and then spread out from there across the last 100 years. And now includes, a lot of stuff to do with psychoanalysis, cognitive behavioral therapy, behaviorism, many different offshoots of psychology. The body-based thing doesn't really seem to fit into that. And that might seem a little bit odd. And the reason why it might seem a little bit odd is because in the early days of psychology, back in the 1920s, Wilhelm Reich, who in many ways in the West is the founder of body-based therapy, was in the Freudian school. He was one of the brightest pupils of Freud. So given that this is true, why does so much of what we now know about body-based therapy not come from these fully kind of legit mainstream sources? And something I just need to mention to step back the history a little bit further is that if you do, try to research shamanic groups, particularly in South America, particularly in North America, the Inuits, and especially in Eastern Russia, in Siberia, you will find similar techniques to many of these kinds of things, all sorts of interesting breathwork processes, all sorts of strange body movement things, and generally distributed around the world. A lot of these techniques, to some degree or other, you will find some of their roots. But really, I just want to acknowledge that, because we're going to be looking more today at the 20th century, the 21st century, and the history in the West. So Wilhelm Reich, to start with, in 1933 he published Character Analysis, which was a classic book originally in German, where he did expound upon his basic theory that, the body is really connected to our psychological reality. That in a sense, the body, particularly the muscles and the body fascia, the interconnecting tissue inside the body, essentially is the substrate from which our personality emerges. Perhaps more easily said by the title of a famous book, Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. With our mind we can create this kind of self-image of being this really healed, open, wonderful, guru-like being, but the body knows the truth. And the body knows the truth because it is where any repressed energy and emotion is stored in muscular armouring or in dropout zones, areas of the muscle system or fascia that have lost their natural toning and responsiveness. So Reich was most definitely heavily on the body-based trail, so to speak, back in the 20s and 30s. But then what happened was the Second World War happened. Reich delved for a while into Marxism, which was very popular in Central Europe before the Second World War. He also was concerned about the rise of Nazism and this kind of thing. It ended up with him kind of fleeing Central Europe for some different places and then settling in New York, I believe, around 1939 when the war started. But the thing for Reich was that, he was such a kind of iconoclast, so to speak, that he would not limit his theorizing to just this newly created field of psychology. He was super interested in physics. He was super interested in all sorts of strange phenomena to do with energy, an energy he called orgone. And he started to get really into this and write a lot of books and material about this. And this stuff never got accepted. It got, poo-pooed by the mainstream psychological establishment. And then a little further down the line in the late 40s, Someone wrote a magazine article accusing Reich of quackery, and the newly created FDA started to investigate him. He ended up getting marginalised, then put in prison. Some of his books even got burnt and that kind of thing. This was back in the 50s in America. And then unfortunately he died in prison about 10 months into a 2-year sentence. And as this happened, so the whole kind of Reichian school in psychology, never mind his physics stuff, became marginalised. Another factor may have been that, if you want to become like a psychoanalyst, you need to be psychoanalyzed yourself. So if you wanted to become like, really skilled with body-based therapy techniques coming from Reich, you would need to go through that very intense journey yourself. So maybe this kind of double whammy of like Reich becoming marginalised and denounced and put in prison and then dying, plus the intensity of the personal journey you'd have to go on, if you wanted to include body-based therapy in what you were doing, those two factors serve to shove Reich right. Those two factors serve to shove Reich right to the margins. So Reich's work got placed right on the margins. It was really outside of mainstream psychology, and it just languished there. And what didn't help, of course, was that Reich had a basic injunction about transmitting knowledge of the actual techniques that he used. For a start, he insisted that anyone who was his student, at the Reich Institute in Maine, had to be a medical doctor. They had to be qualified as a medical doctor, and thus under the Hippocratic Oath, they weren't allowed to reveal the actual techniques. And that injunction, carried through, for a very, very long time. No one wrote about Reich's stuff. A little further down the line, one of Reich's students, Alexander Lowen, who did train as a doctor so he could work with Reich, developed his own thing, bioenergetics, which we've been looking at. And although Lowen was a prolific writer, writing something like 15 books on the subject of bioenergetics and psychology, he again, only one book includes some techniques and really not so much. Given that all this marginalisation and the injunctions against transmitting information about the techniques happened like back in the 50s, how then do we now know about bioenergetics, some 70 years later? And the reason for that is twofold. There were two basic streams that emerged where these techniques came back, and both were a bit on the margins, to say the least. The first was the treatment of drug addiction in the late 50s and 60s in the United States of America. The second was from India and then later America, Osho, the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, a guru and many would say cult leader. So let's take a look at these two sources briefly. In post-war America, drug addiction was a problem. And so what happened, a lot of people using heroin on the street and other drugs of abuse. And it was seen that, it may be part and parcel of living in a kind of free society, so to speak, that there's high drug access. And then inevitably a lot of people who were using drugs ended up in the criminal justice system, and sending them all to prison was seen as a bit of a drag and a lot of money that the state would have to pay to keep them in prison. So what happened was that the drug-using person in the criminal justice system in the States was not just given the option of prison. They could also go into a kind of rehab centre where they, along with other drug users, and undergo a therapeutic program aimed at getting them off drugs. And examples of these programs were organisations called Synanon, Daytop, and also Phoenix House. There are a few others, and this very, very interesting aspect of the history of therapy or the history of psychology, there's very, very little information about it. I think there's a famous book by a guy called Jablonski to do with group therapy, and without digging too much into the fact that there's not so much info about it, basically a lot of addicts live together in a tightly enclosed residential framework where they couldn't just leave. You'd get 1 or 2 hours off a week. You're kind of, I think they used to call it walk around time, and you got given maybe walk around money, like maybe 75 cents, and you would be very excited all week, to decide, what are you going to spend your 75 cents on when you had your 1.5 hours walk around time. But anyway, within this tightly held community, which was usually run by former drug users who completed the program and were now clean, very intense therapeutic practices were utilised. the people who were running the centres drew on all of the knowledge. They drew on Reichian stuff. They drew on a thing called encounter therapy, where you're working a lot with the judgments you have about other people and the judgments they have about you. They utilised marathon space, such as going through the night, maybe several nights in a row, to break down the mind's resistance to talking about and feeling what's going on inside. They used the techniques of primal therapy and catharsis, getting people in the group to scream and shout and really put out emotions. It was a super challenging and volatile environment, and it was essentially a therapeutic mixing pot, because the drug users were seen as people that it was absolutely legit to really experiment on with these techniques. And of course, the people running the structures and holding the program had already been through it themselves. So a lot of the techniques of body-based therapy came from this scene. They emerged from this scene. Therapists came out of this scene. Maybe they stopped working for Synanon or Daytop or whatever, Phoenix House, and they set up their own places. Maybe they took on students, worked with clients a lot, this kind of thing. This is one big source. And then the other, which is kind of related source because they crossed over a bit, was the Bhagwan. The Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho. He changed his name shortly before he passed away in January 1990. He was a tantric guru originally from Mumbai, and then set up in Pune, India. And then he also ran a somewhat controversial project in Oregon for 5 years, from about 1980 to 86, something like that. Ended up back in Pune and then passed away in 1990. And without going too much into the controversy around Osho or the kind of meditation techniques that he taught, really the most significant thing about Osho in this context is that an awful lot of therapists went to Osho. And Osho understood Reich's work. He'd spoken a little bit about Reich, he spoke about Freud, and he encouraged people coming into the ashram, to join groups, to go and do, 3-day encounter workshop underground where you'd face all your deep, dark demons and hopefully come out the other side. There was quite some crossover between the therapists who were working the drug treatment centres and the therapists who rocked up at Osho's ashram in Pune, India. A lot of the same guys involved. And this great melting pot energy with hundreds of therapists coming together and a plentiful supply of students who just come to the ashram, and the Bhagwan Osho was telling them you need to do groups. So again, it was this very great melting pot environment where a lot of these techniques could the knowledge of them could spread, and also new variations could emerge. For example, New York-based therapist Dan Kazrael developed a technique called bonding, where he would lie on top of his clients, one at a time, and get them to free associate, scream and shout and make sound. And then in the Osho scene, a therapist by the name of Varesh, Denny Yuson Sanchez, who I did quite a lot of training with before he passed away, he took this technique and he said, okay, because he was a group therapist, let's get the clients to sit holding on to each other in a supportive way, and each to express and scream and make noise, not at each other, but away from each other. And the reason these techniques were so powerful was because when you're in this close physical proximity with someone, your body, your nervous system feels safer to release. So this is an example of how, techniques emerged and evolved and this kind of thing. Now, when we start to consider breath work, there was breath work, in the drug treatment centres and also in the Osho scene, but it was a bit wider. There were also a lot of people getting into breath work. A lot came, as we've seen, from the work of Lenador. I spoke about that in an earlier episode on rebirthing. But understanding breath work, understanding these other therapies, one thing that's common to them is they can create huge change. If you're doing psychoanalysis, it's a much slower process. You may end up creating a lot of huge change, but it's more like your mind, your egoic sense of self is on board with the whole thing. Whereas if you jump into like an encounter group, or you start doing these really intense cathartic exercises, if you start doing, 4-hour rebirthing sessions, that goes very, very deep, very, very quickly. And you come out perhaps feeling like you're just completely reborn. Literally like you're just starting your life again. It would often feel like that when you came out of these intense workshops. And so this became very attractive to people with a kind of cult-like kind of affiliation, because cults were a big thing back in the 60s and 70s, coming out of particularly California and the acid generation, Timothy Leary and stuff. a lot of people were interested in really creating an entirely new society. And what better way to create an entirely new society than but to give people this kind of feeling of actually being reborn, so that your mind could be kind of reprogrammed in a different way. Even if you study guys like Charles Manson, he used LSD to break down the kind of ego of the people who were attracted to his cult. And then he reprogrammed them, and even decades later, many members of Manson's family, what he called the cult, said that, that they still heard his voice inside their head. It was very hard to return to normal society. Manson's obviously a very extreme and very violent and not at all nice person, but when you look at many of the other cults, some were more probably on the fringes of okayness. But this is not about the cults themselves and judgments. It's more like, the cults also adopted these techniques. And in many ways, of course, for Bhagwan, Osho himself was a cult leader, let's face it. And in fact, the place where I learned a lot of these techniques, not all of this stuff, but a lot of it came from my time in the Osho scene. Devaraj is an Osho name. And I lived nearly 2 decades inside an Osho community in the UK. So really, most of what we know about these techniques, whilst it might have originated with Reich or maybe with shamanic people back in, 100, 200 years ago, it got crystallized in these scenes around cults, around drug treatment centers in the US, and from there it emerged as therapists came out. Maybe they'd had enough of the Bhagwan or whoever, and they just dropped their sannyas name, went back to their regular name, and just started working in San Francisco as a therapist. Maybe they tried to start their own school of some aspect of body-based therapy up. But of course, these guys, for the most part, weren't regarded as within mainstream psychology. They didn't have ClinPsych PhD or whatever, so the schools and the things that they set up tended to get marginalised and again pushed to the periphery. And now another big thing which needs to be spoken about around this whole cult scene and the breathwork scene and the cults that developed a little bit from that. And I'm using the word cult very loosely here. I don't want to offend anybody. But generally, a kind of alternative living schema, essentially. But something that must be said, but this was a very kind of masculine phase. And so men in the hierarchy of these groups, whether it was breathwork, some other body-based therapy technique, tantra, whatever, often would, use their power in a way that was somewhat dubious, such as making use of the status differential and the fact that many women are very sexually attracted to men with status, to have sex with a lot of the people coming into their environs, as clients or as people joining the group, joining the cult, whatever. This was essentially pretty much the norm for many of these organizations at this time. Even though, for example, it's another story, but the Osho scene was basically a matriarchal cult. It was a matriarchal cult. Osho was a man, but all the power underneath Osho was devolved by women. Nevertheless, there was this thing where a lot of the men were using their status in the hierarchy in a way that, by today's standards, certainly wouldn't be considered appropriate. So this is another reason why a lot of their work got marginalised, basically. What tends to happen is, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater because a therapist or a kind of, new age leader, is found guilty of various transgressions and abusing clients or people in his organization's boundaries, then the work with which he's associated gets negatively marginalized as well, which often is a big pity because a lot of the work was great. It's just that the person delivering it wasn't as clean as he should have been in his boundaries. So really what we're looking at here is this big explosion of this kind of work from, say, 1970 to 2000, which then started to dissipate off quite strongly after 2010, with therapists getting older, the whole cult-like thing collapsing, scandals around sexual abuse or certainly not holding clear boundaries. The whole thing kind of collapsed and dissipated. Wilhelm Reich forbidding people, even years after he had passed away, no one was speaking about the techniques that he developed. So literally by the time, say, 2015 came round, you were looking at the possibility that all the knowledge would literally drop off a cliff and be lost to posterity, because so few books had been written, so few people had described the techniques. People who knew them, often were the therapists, were just passing them on to students. They weren't really writing books. They didn't want to disseminate the knowledge to the wider world for some rather dubious reasons to do with, they wanted to be the guru, basically. And so by 2010, we were hitting a point where it was literally falling off a cliff. And young people, maybe in their 20s, getting interested in therapy, this stuff just wasn't really available to them anymore. It had died off. Now, one big exception or something that came along, something that, a real light on the horizon that came along around this time is a thing called the Reich Homebook, which was written by a California, I think, based therapist called Jack Willis. Willis was an associate of Israel Regardie, who was also well known in occult affairs in San Francisco, a British American, and Christopher Hyatt. Not originally his original name, but also a fairly, avant-garde, slightly out there therapist guru type. And Hyatt commissioned Willis basically to write down all the stuff that he'd got, that he'd learned. He'd learned from Regardie, who'd learned it from a guy I think called Philip Kukurutu, who learned it direct from Reich. And so Willis started to do this at the behest of Chris Hyatt. Somewhere along that rather lengthy process, some kind of dispute emerged between Hyatt and Willis. So Willis disconnected from Hyatt but continued with the work. And when it was eventually finished, I think it was quite near the time when he actually passed away, sometime around between 2005 and 2010, he elected to just free publish it as a big PDF on the internet. And it's known as the Reich Homebook. It's also available from Amazon and stuff. You can pay for a published version, a proper paperback. It's called something like Reichian Therapy for Home Use or something like that, but it's essentially the same book. So this book, which we'll probably look at a little bit later when we get to Reichian breathwork, is one of a few examples of actual written stuff which really came down to us. And then from about 2015, 2016, I started a YouTube channel. I realised there's very little information about bioenergetics online. I wanted to pursue it myself more, went online to look for it and found, my God, there's just nothing there. There's Elliot, and he's giving out a little bit of technique, but he's not so experienced as a therapist. Good guy, but not so experienced as a therapist. And so I thought, well, I know quite a lot of this stuff, so I'm going to start to put it out. And that led eventually to me writing books and stuff like that. And there's been the odd other person in the field, but the tendency is for them, they've come more from the kind of mainstream psychology, and those guys just don't know this stuff. They just don't know these techniques. They haven't been through these very intense, almost initiatory rebirth experiences around these kinds of therapies. And so it's not so easy for them to create really authentic content about this work. And nowadays, I've started my own school of body-based therapy with people training online, basically, and we've got, a kind of format together and it's working pretty well. Most of the people who complete the training and graduate go out and lead sessions in person and on Zoom. And so the work can start to move out a little bit, and I feel very, nourished by this aspect of my work. Really, it's a bit experimental doing so much online, but the good thing is that it means a lot of people without much money, often younger people, can get involved in it and find out about it. And hopefully, this inspires more people to get up there, get out and put it out. Okay, so hopefully this has been a useful kind of secret history of body-based therapy. Thank you so much for tuning in. Do feel free to check out my website, bioenergetics.org.uk. I've got books and video courses and free downloads and stuff. There's also my YouTube channel, of course, where you're probably watching this. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you again shortly for more foundations of bioenergetics. Thank you.